Intentionality. Memory can also be divided in terms of how the information is initially encoded. Recall that encoding refers to the deployment of attention and the creation of a mental representation. Here we can create a distinction in terms of intentionality. Some encoding is intentional, while other encoding is incidental. For example, intentional encoding might include studying information for an exam or trying to remember an email address. In keeping with our example of shopping at a farmer's market, intentional memory is committing a list of things to buy to memory. This is intentional encoding because you intend to store and later recall the information. This contrasts with incidental encoding, which refers to learning by association or exposure. For example, you probably know the melody and words of many popular songs that you didn't necessarily intend to encode, store, and recall. It's just that hearing them in various locations and in different scenarios has allowed you to learn them incidentally. Incidental learning is also important for certain kinds of non-declarative memory. For example, learning the grammar rules for your native language happened incidentally when you were young, implicitly. Caregivers and adults spoke to you, asked you questions, and addressed you using grammatical structures, and you began to acquire some of these grammatical structures without explicit instruction. Effortful and non-effortful memory. A related construct is effortful encoding. Some information is going to require more effort to store and possibly more effort to retrieve. New information, for example, information that you are studying as part of a class, may require more effort than familiar information. Information that is more coherent requires less effort than information that is less coherent. Information that is contained within a narrative or an organized schema will require less effort to encode and retrieve than information that is relatively unstructured. On the other hand, some memories can be retrieved automatically. Many procedural memories are retrieved automatically and without much awareness. When you are shopping at the farmer's market, for example, seeing the butternut squash triggers an automatic retrieval of the memory for that item on your shopping list. Implicit and explicit memory. A distinction that is very similar to the distinction of effort is the implicit-explicit distinction. Declarative memories are often explicit in nature, that is, when you are studying information for an exam, you put effort into encoding it and you engage in an explicit recall. You are explicitly trying to recall the information, but the overall thinking process also has a role for implicit retrieval. Let's go back to our example of shopping at the farmer's market. You have purchased your butternut squash and then you decide to purchase some fresh onions and some garlic, thinking that the squash roasted with onions and garlic will be delicious. You may have in mind the finished dish for a recipe, but it may not be an explicit process that retrieves that memory and influences your decision. Rather, the decision to buy the onions and garlic happens quickly as a result of implicit retrieval. Implicit retrieval means that memory influences your behavior even if you are not consciously aware that it is happening. Many examples of the effects of memory on thinking and judgment, like the availability heuristic, are the result of the influence of information that was retrieved quickly and without much conscious awareness. Expectations and processing effects. Expectations can affect recall. Our memory and knowledge for things affects our ability to think about them and make decisions. Consider a straightforward example. If you think about your university classes or college classes, many of them involve studying and learning information that you will later need to recall during an exam. Two common forms of examination are the multiple choice exam and the written essay exam. Do your expectations for how you will be tested and examined affect the way in which you attempt to learn the information? Do you study differently for a multiple choice exam than you do for an essay exam? When I ask my students this question in class, nearly all of them indicate that they do study differently. After all, a multiple choice exam involves a recognition memory. You are given a statement and you need to recognize and retrieve the correct answer. You need to be able to eliminate plausible alternatives. As such, when preparing for this kind of exam, you are likely to emphasize exact terms to maximize the likelihood that you will recognize the correct answer and minimize the likelihood that you will falsely recognize one of the distractors as being correct. On the other hand, when you are preparing for an essay exam, you know that you will be asked to elaborate on information and recall it, often without a reliable cue. You may not need to recognize a correct answer and distinguish it from distractors, but you may be asked to look for underlying themes and a deeper understanding of the information. So we are likely to agree that we prepare differently for these two kinds of exams. But what would happen if you prepared for an essay exam, but on the day of the exam, the instructor indicated that you would be taking a multiple choice exam instead. What if you had prepared to write a multiple choice exam and were informed that you were going to be writing an essay instead? When I asked students in a class, most of them indicate that they would be very unhappy with either surprise. They also indicate that they think their performance on the unexpected exam would suffer relative to how they would have done in the exam they had expected and studied for. Barbara Tversky and several other researchers investigated this very idea. In 1973, a subsequent meta-analysis, 1991, found that across many different studies, students usually performed better when they were tested with the kind of exam they were expecting. In other words, expectations affected the encoding strategy. When the encoding strategy matched the expected retrieval for exam mode, performance benefited. When there was a mismatch, performance suffered. These studies on test preparation are in line with a long tradition of research that looks at the amount or depth of processing that goes into acquiring information and how that processing affects the nature of the representation that is stored. Another way of saying this is that the way in which you think about an idea, object, or event when you are learning about it affects the information you are able to store as part of the representation. 3.1 Theory in the Real World. Memory research suggests that people will remember things better when there is some correspondence between the learning and coding phase and the test recall phase. Indeed, when students learn information under the expectation that they will be tested in a certain way, they perform better when they are tested according to those expectations. So it is not surprising that there is a tendency to look to other possible ways to increase the match between learning and testing. One of the most enduring is the idea of learning styles. In the educational psychology literature, the concept of learning styles is the idea that people have different ways of learning, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and that they will retain information better if they are able to learn in their preferred style. On the surface, this seems to make sense. When asked, people often give a preference, and this would also seem to connect to the literature on memory encoding and retrieval. The problem is that there is no reliable empirical evidence that people have these learning styles and that they will learn better if they receive information in their preferred style. Hal Pashler, a cognitive psychologist at the University of California at San Diego, has studied this issue in detail and set out what would be the minimal conditions needed to show evidence for the effectiveness of learning styles. Namely, students of one of the three self-described learning styles should be randomly assigned to learning conditions that either match or do not match their preferred style. In order for the test to be considered reliable, learners would be assigned to conditions without knowing which condition they were in, known as a blinded design. All students would then be tested for retention, and evidence for learning styles would be shown by an interaction between retention and learning styles condition. People should perform better if they learn in their preferred styles. Pashler and colleagues noted that very few studies employed this strong design, and that the few studies that did use appropriate methodology often found evidence that contradicted the learning styles hypothesis. They concluded that there is no adequate evidence base to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general educational practice. The idea of learning styles has persisted, however, because it seems to have an intuitive appeal. It is one of many neuromyths. A neuromyth is a widespread belief about the brain that is not supported by evidence. The best-known example is the idea that most of us only use 10% of our brain. There is no evidence for this, and it's biologically impossible, yet people often believe it. The best way to avoid believing in neuromyths is to learn about cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, and then take a critical look at the evidence supporting common beliefs. Sometimes the evidence is supportive and sometimes it's not. Levels of processing. The great example of the effects of processing efforts and depth on memory comes from an early study in the 1970s by Craig and Tulving. In their work, they argued for the role of different levels of processing on memory storage. They suggested that incoming stimuli, for example things that are being processed and learned, are subjected to a series of processes. Shallow processing refers to processing information at the sensory and surface level. Deep processing refers to processing information in terms of semantics and meaning. In general, they argued that deeper processing brought about better recall of the information in subsequent tests. In one study, subjects were asked to learn words in various encoding conditions. All subjects learned the same list. In the structural condition, subjects were asked to say yes or no to the question, is the word in capital letters? Half of the words were presented in capital letters and the other half were presented in lowercase letters, so the answer was always yes or no. It should be immediately apparent that this question does not require the learner to spend much effort thinking about the word and what it means. In fact, you can easily do this task with words you don't even know, with non-words, with your eyes out of focus, etc. You don't even need to be able to read the word to answer this question correctly, only to notice the presence of capital or lowercase letters. In another condition, the phonemic condition, subjects were asked to answer the question, does the word rhyme with blank? And this blank was filled in with the word that either rhymed or did not rhyme with the target word that they were trying to learn. In this case, subjects needed to read the word and think about how it sounded in order to answer the question correctly. In a third condition, the semantic condition, subjects were asked to answer a question about the object using the word itself. In other words, the solution required sentence verification. In this condition, in order to answer the question correctly, subjects needed to think about what the word actually meant. When the participants were later tested with a recognition test, those who learned in the semantic condition performed the best. It seems that attending to the meaning of the word encouraged deeper processing, a stronger representation, and better performance on a memory test. This is a robust finding and has been replicated and extended in a number of different studies and labs. Even when subjects were not told that this was a memory test, engaging in the deeper processing required by the semantic condition still resulted in a fairly good performance on the recall task. Other experiments controlled for the amount of time subjects spent processing the initial word, and even when they were made to process the words for longer durations in the shallow conditions, performance was still better in the deeper semantic conditions. The central message is the memory for information can be strengthened when the information is given considerable effortful thought. Memory errors. The 7 sins. We have discussed how deeper processing results in better recall and possibly in more elaborate memory traces. In addition, we have also discussed how activation spreads among nodes and related concepts. From this, we can conclude that a rich contextual setting and strong semantic associations will result in better memory. Which is true, but there is a bit of a downside here. The very things that seem to help memory to function in the most adaptive way possible, strong associations, a rich prior knowledge base, strong conceptual coherence among the items to be learned, may also encourage errors. A nice summary was provided by the memory researcher Daniel Schachter, 1999. He published an article in American Psychologist called The 7 Sins of Memory, in which he lays out 7 ways in which the very features that allow our memories to work so well also guarantee various kinds of errors. The 7 sins are transience, absent-mindedness, blocking, misattribution, suggestibility, bias, and persistence. All 7 have implications for how thinking can be affected by and even undermined by memory failures. The first 2, transience and absent-mindedness, are really just everyday memory failures. Information fades over time or information is not encoded strongly because the learner does not allocate sufficient resources. As an example, you can probably remember many times when reading a text for a class that you kind of spaced out and forgot what you had just read. That kind of absent-mindedness results in a memory failure. In order to work properly, memory often requires some degree of attention. The third sin, blocking, essentially means a temporary retrieval failure or lack of access. This might be due to spreading activation in a semantic memory network. As the activation spreads to many concepts, they all receive some activation and it is difficult to determine which one is the correct fact. This is seen most strongly in the so-called tip of the tongue phenomenon. This is where you are asked a question and you know the answer, but you cannot generate it. In many instances, you can almost feel yourself saying the answer. It's as if some of the information is present, including the information needed to speak the word, but not at high enough levels to be activated. Misattribution and suggestibility are both errors that also arise from the highly associated aspects of semantic networks. In the case of misattribution, an error comes about when a person remembers the fact correctly but may not be able to remember the correct source. Imagine being asked to learn a list of words and then falsely remembering a word that may not have been on the list because it is highly associated with the words that are on the list. We will discuss this specific case in greater detail below. This is an error, and one that is perfectly understandable given a spreading activation account of memory. Suggestibility is the tendency to update for past events based on current descriptions. Memory is malleable and suggestible. Finally, bias and persistence both reflect our own intuitions about our memories. We often show a bias to assume that what we remember has reflected events that actually happened. In other words, we trust our own memories. and with good reason. If a false memory or an error arises from a feeling of remembrance that comes from having a highly associated semantic network, it is reasonable to assume that we are remembering something that happened rather than just responding to a state of activation that does not reflect the past. Our memories often have the unfortunate characteristic of being persistent when we don't want them to be. Traumatic events, unhappy events, and other events that we would like to forget are often difficult to forget because of their initial salience or emotional content, or because of intrusive recollection and rumination. Every time we think about that unfortunate event, we strengthen the initial trace. Dwelling on an unfortunate event in the past is likely to make that memory trace all the stronger. These 7 sins are fairly broadly defined and are all examples of memory errors that come about because of a structured semantic memory. Let's go back to our example of the farmer's market. Imagine you have entered the market, examined the fruits and vegetables available at one of the stands, and moved on to another stand. Your friend who is with you asks if the first vendor has lemons for sale. Did they have lemons? Did you actually see lemons, or do you just think that you saw lemons? They may have had lemons, as they had other fruits, but you may find yourself not being 100% certain that you actually saw lemons there. Perhaps you are just inferring the presence of those lemons based on your knowledge of produce vendors in general. In other words, your semantic memory representation of a produce vendor may have a lemon feature. That feature will be activated when you visit the produce stand, even if you don't explicitly see the lemons. It is a spreading activation effect. The DRM task. Seeking to demonstrate the ease with which false memories can be created, psychologist Harry Rodinger explored an interesting paradigm which is now known as the Deese, Rodinger, and McDermott paradigm, or the DRM task. In the canonical version of the task, subjects are presented with a list of words that they are instructed to remember. In the most well-known example, subjects might see the following words: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, snap, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy. Crucially, note that the word sleep is not on this list, and yet all of these words are connected to the concept sleep. In the DRM task, subjects were given several lists of words like this, and were asked after each list to recall as many words as possible. After 6 lists, they were given a recognition task, which included words from the study lists, new words, and the critical target words that were not on the list but were highly associated, for example, sleep. False recognition of the target words was prevalent in the subjects. Indeed, in subsequent investigations, subjects were convinced that the target word had been presented. In versions of the task when subjects were asked to indicate a distinction between whether or not they remembered the word or whether they just knew the word, most subjects indicated that they explicitly remembered seeing that word. This is clearly a memory error. The word, though highly associated, was not present. Subjects who indicate remembering it are demonstrating a source misattribution error. Spreading activation among all of the related words results in high activation of the target words, and this is strong enough to result in a false memory. Change blindness. If you are having a conversation with a stranger and you look away for a moment, you assume that when you look back, the same person will be there talking to you. Evidence suggests that this assumption is so strong that if the person were to change places with someone else, you wouldn't even notice. This failure of memory and attention is known as change blindness. The phenomenon was originally noted by Daniel Simons. One version of the study involved 2 experimenters, a research assistant, and a subject. One of the experimenters would approach a subject on the campus with a map and ask for directions. While the subject was giving directions to the experimenter, 2 researchers carrying a door or a large board would walk in between the researcher asking for directions and the subject. The door was positioned such that the subject would not be able to see the 2 researchers carrying the door, and for a brief time would not be able to see the researcher asking for instructions. As they were walking by, one of the carriers switched places with the person asking for directions. Once they passed, the subject would be left talking to a different person, the researcher who was initially carrying the board. In nearly every case, the subjects did not notice that they were talking to another person. They carried on giving instructions as if they hadn't even noticed. Later questioning revealed few of them noticed the change blindness paradigm. A shows someone asking for directions, B shows them holding a door and being covered, C shows a different guy, and then D shows the guys together. They do look quite similar. Figure 3.4. Frames from a video of a subject from Simon and Levin's 1998 Experiment 1. Frames A to C show the sequence of the switch. Frame D shows the 2 experimenters side by side. Other versions of the study involved a more controlled setting. A subject walks into a research lab and approaches a counter where a researcher stands with an informed consent form. The researcher gives the consent form to the subject, and the subject reads and signs it and hands it back to the researcher. The researcher then pretends to duck down in order to file the form. At the moment when the researcher is out of view, they switch places with another researcher who then stands up and continues with the introduction to the study. Most subjects do not notice the change and do not even notice that anything unusual happened. In both of these cases, subjects are said to be blind to a change. This represents a failure to encode the present situation strongly enough. It also suggests a reasonable expectation that a current situation will not change arbitrarily, but the implications for memory and thinking are clear. If you cannot trust your memory to let you know when something has changed, you may not be able to trust your memory for details in longer-term situations. This would be especially salient in eyewitnesses to crimes. If a subject doesn't notice a research assistant switching places, they may not be able to notice enough details about a perpetrator in a crime to be able to reliably identify them. I will discuss other failures of eyewitness testimony in Chapter 5 on language and cognition. Memory and expert performance. An extensive semantic memory network is also a crucial aspect of thinking and expertise. We have already discussed briefly and will discuss in greater detail in Chapter 11 how experts often transition from a reliance on rules, the textbook method, and algorithms to retrieved examples. This is seen very strongly in medical diagnosis. Jeff Norman and Lee Brooks have argued that expert medical diagnosis and clinical reasoning depend on the expert clinician having a rich, highly interconnected knowledge network. Whereas residents and novice physicians may start out basing diagnoses on textbook examples and diagnostic rules, experts are more likely to base their diagnoses on how much the current patient resembles a previously seen patient. Experts have likely diagnosed and interacted with many patients, and so they have a rich knowledge base from which they can draw these inferences and make these diagnoses. Thus, errors in memory may result in errors in diagnosis. An interesting example of how expert medical doctors use memory to assist in diagnoses comes from several studies undertaken by Les Gold and colleagues. They were interested in the cognitive processes that underlie the reading and interpretation of X-rays by radiologists. If you have never seen an X-ray, it is pretty easy to get the overall gist of what you are looking at if there is something familiar to you, such as a skull or a bone. But for any kind of detail, it can be very challenging. Radiologists are physicians who have been trained to interpret medical images like X-rays. In one of Les Gold et al.'s studies, they asked experienced radiologists and medical school students to examine X-ray images for 2 seconds and then provide a diagnosis. In other conditions, the experts and novices were given longer periods of time to examine the X-rays. One of the interesting things they discovered was that the expert radiologists quickly developed a schema for what they were looking at. In other words, experts didn't need to process aspects of the image that were familiar to them. If they were seeing an X-ray of a lung, they could rely on their own memory representations for what lungs look like and fill in the gaps from memory rather than directly from perception. That way, they could compare the image with the schema and examine pathological differences. Novices have a less well-developed schema and weaker memory representations for X-ray images of lungs, so they needed to spend more time processing the actual image because they were not able to rely on an internalized memory representation for lung X-rays. This decreased their ability to notice pathologies. A possible caveat to this expert advantage might be that if experts are expecting a certain pathology to emerge and rely on memory representations to fill in the details, they may miss other abnormalities. In fact, this is what researchers found. Strong memory representations usually confer an advantage to experts, but occasionally result in errors when the memory representations get in the way of unusual abnormalities. Schema theory. The previous discussion of memory representation, knowledge structures, and memory systems emphasizes how knowledge is stored and represented. However, as we are primarily concerned with how memory is involved in the thinking process, it is useful to have a conceptual framework that addresses the interaction between representation and other thinking behaviors, such as problem solving and hypothesis testing. One theory that addresses this interaction is schema theory. For our purposes, we can define a memory schema as a general-purpose knowledge structure that encodes information and stores information about common events and situations. This representation is used for understanding events and situations. For example, let's consider again the idea of going to a farmer's market. We have already discussed all the ways in which memory is involved, and we have mentioned the possibility that the shopper may have a script or schema for how to behave and what to expect in a farmer's market. Assuming that you, as the shopper, have been to farmers markets or city markets before, you have encoded information about each event, stored episodic memories, semantic memories, and retrieved and used those memories during the event. The schema is the conceptual framework that allows those memory representations to generate expectations. When you arrive at the market, you expect to see several produce vendors, you expect someone to be selling fresh cut flowers, and you expect the majority of the transactions will be conducted with cash rather than credit. Seen in this way, a schema is not a semantic memory representation per se, but rather it is a representation of how memory should be used in thinking. In the Lesgold et al. 1981 studies with radiologists, the researchers concluded that the expert radiologists activated several pathology schemas. They activated a general-purpose knowledge structure that, in addition to containing semantic memory and visual memory, also contained a set of expectations and predictions. The expert radiologists can use schemas and memory to fill in the details of the X-ray even if they didn't actually see them. They expect certain things to be there. Similarly, you don't need to see the cut flower vendor at the farmer's market. You may expect him to be there, and if asked later, you might respond affirmatively even if you did not actually see him. Sometimes, however, an activated schema will cause a person to miss features that are inconsistent with that schema. We mentioned already that expert radiologists might miss other novel pathologies that are not consistent with a diagnostic schema and a set of diagnostic expectations. This is referred to as premature closure in diagnosis. But this general idea was demonstrated many years ago by the pioneering work of Bransford and Johnson, 1973. In one study, they showed that people often miss key features in a text if those features do not fit with a schema. Subjects were asked to read the following paragraph, which was given the title, "Watching a Peace March from the 40th Floor." The view was breathtaking. From the window, one could see the crowd below. Everything looked extremely small from such a distance, but the colorful costumes could still be seen. Everyone seemed to be moving in one direction in an orderly fashion, and there seemed to be little children as well as adults. The landing was gentle, and luckily the atmosphere was such that no special suits had to be worn. At first there was a great deal of activity. Later, when the speeches started, the crowd quieted down. The man with the television camera took many shots of the setting and the crowd. Everyone was very friendly and seemed glad when the music started. It is a pretty straightforward paragraph, and it probably conforms to our schema of being in a city, watching some sort of demonstration or parade or civic action. As a result, we can probably imagine or fill in details that may or may not be actually present in the text. Crucially, we might miss the sentence that states, "The landing was gentle, and luckily the atmosphere was such that no special suits had to be worn." This sentence has nothing to do with watching a peace march. It does not conform to the activated schema for an urban environment or a demonstration. As a result, when subjects were asked to answer questions about the paragraph they had read, they often did not remember this sentence. The conclusion is that we miss things that are inconsistent with a schema. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that we always miss things that are not consistent with the general schema. For example, I am sure you have a schema that reflects your expectations of a standard college or university lecture. You might be sitting in the seat with your notebook or laptop, and an instructor is at the front of the class with a whiteboard, a chalkboard, or PowerPoint slides. If the instructor stopped in the middle of the lecture, unplugged your laptop, and threw it across the classroom, that scenario would not fit with your schema, but it would be so jarring that it would be very memorable. Clearly, very shocking or surprising deviations from the schema will be memorable. Other research suggests that details that may not be consistent with the schema are still encoded, but may not become part of the primary representation unless a new schema is introduced. Consider a now classic study by Anderson and Pichard, 1978. Subjects in the experiment were asked to read a passage about two boys walking through a house. In addition, they were given a context to the paragraph before reading it. One group of subjects was told to imagine that they were a house burglar. Another group of subjects was asked to consider the passage from the perspective of a potential home buyer. They were then asked to remember details about the following passage. The two boys ran until they came to the driveway. "See, I told you today was good for skipping school," said Mark. "Mom is never home on Thursday," he added. Tall hedges hid the house from the road, so the pair strolled across the finely landscaped yard. "I never knew your place was so big," said Pete. "Yeah, but it's nicer now than it used to be since Dad had the new stone siding put on and added the fireplace." There were front and back doors and a side door which led to the garage, which was empty except for 3 parked 10-speed bikes. They went to the side door, Mark explaining that it was always open in case his younger sisters got home earlier than their mother. Pete wanted to see the house, so Mark started with the living room. It, like the rest of the downstairs, was newly painted. Mark turned on the stereo, the noise of which worried Pete. "Don't worry, the nearest house is a 1/4 of a mile away," Mark shouted. Pete felt more comfortable, observing that no houses could be seen in any direction beyond the huge yard. The dining room, with all the china, silver, and cut glass, was no place to play, so the boys moved into the kitchen, where they made sandwiches. Mark said they wouldn't go to the basement because it had been damp and musty ever since the new plumbing had been installed. "This is where my dad keeps his famous paintings and his coin collection," Mark said as they peered into the den. Mark bragged that he could get spending money whenever he needed since he discovered that his dad kept a lot in the desk drawer. There were 3 upstairs bedrooms. Mark showed Pete his mother's closet, which was filled with furs, and the locked box, which held her jewels. His sister's room was uninteresting except for the color TV, which Mark carried to his room. Mark bragged that the bathroom in the hall was his since one had been added to his sister's room for their use. The big highlight in his room, though, was a leak in the ceiling where the old roof had finally rotted. Not surprisingly, subjects recalled more information that was consistent with the context of the schema they were given. If you were told to read the paragraph with the context of a burglar in mind, you would remember things about famous paintings and coin collections, a closet full of furs, and the side door that was always open. If you were asked to read this from the context of a prospective homebuyer, you might think about the bathroom addition, the leak in the ceiling, and the newly painted downstairs. These are schema-consistent details. However, the researchers then asked subjects to consider the paragraph that they had already read from the perspective of the other context. Subjects who read it from the perspective of a burglar were then asked to reconsider, but not reread, it from the perspective of a homebuyer and vice versa. Subjects recalled additional detail when asked to reinspect their memory from the alternative context. The implication seems to be that the information was encoded and processed, but because it did not fit a schema initially, it was not recalled as well. When given a reorganizing context or reorganizing framework, new details were recalled. Our memories, it seems, are quite flexible. Summary. Memory, which we often think of as storage of past events, is also what allows us to predict the future. When you encounter a new situation, a new person, or a new object, you immediately assess its similarity to previously encountered things. You may recognize an event or a person as being familiar, even if it is a novel situation. If you recognize that this new but familiar event shares a similarity with a previous event, you know what to expect. You know how to behave towards this new event because it is similar to something you have experienced before. You can predict the future with some reasonable certainty, based on a similarity to previously stored memories. This process is not perfect, of course. We make mistakes and errors, but it's important to realize that many of the errors we make are a function of a system that's functioning properly and is an incredibly powerful aspect of human thought. This is the basis of induction, decision-making, and problem-solving.